the best snapshot of your overall health and well-being and your ultimately your longevity will rely just upon like maybe 6 to 10 objective biomarkers that we can easily measure even at home. There's like kits that we use.
Can you walk through them slowly-ish?
Okay.
Like I've actually longed for this answer, but people always, it's like so much heady shit and I can't track it. Like, what are those?
Yeah, well, our conversation, prior to getting on the show here was talking about continuous glucose monitoring. So that is a technology maybe everyone, not at this time, can afford, but it's probably the most important metabolic biomarker that we can track and should keep control of. So you can do.
So anybody that doesn't know glucose, sugar, right, could come in the form of carbohydrate.
Yeah.
It's not always going to say sugar on the package, but your body turns that into glucose, which is essentially sugar in your bloodstream.
Yeah, and the lower the better. So
why?
Why? Because, well, if your fasting blood glucose or say average glycemia that you can directly measure with continuous glucose monitor, the correlate to that indirect would be hemoglobin A1C. And if you're above 6.5, you're diabetic.
And that's basically how much sugar has bound to your, I forget which cell?
Glycated hemoglobin red blood cell.
Okay, so red blood cells have sticky sugar molecules stuck to them and they become inefficient, or are they actually at that point problematic?
Well, it is a correlate to the level of glycemia that you have in your body, and we know that proteins getting glycated, that's not a good thing. But the important thing is that if your inflammation markers, and a global marker would be C-reactive protein or high sensitive C-reactive protein, which can measure in that low range. So if your immune system becomes activated, for example, if you have an intestinal bug like a gastroenteritis, whether bacterial or viral, and I've seen this before in myself and traveling and getting like a little stomach bug, HSCRP goes through the roof. And this kind of results, the etiology of all this is in the gut, right? So if your gut lining becomes compromised in any way through a virus or bacterial or something that you eat, then that triggers inflammation. And I've gotten like a stomach bug, maybe 2 or 3 times in the last 10 years. And I quickly do a whole cardiometabolic blood work profile and
just to see what's happening.
Just to see what's happening it's been very insightful and basically showing that your immune system really goes haywire if there's any kind of perturbation in the intestinal mucosa. And that can trigger permeability of the blood-brain barrier, and that can be neurotoxic, I mean, if you want to put a term to it, because, and this can happen if you have, Epstein-Barr virus, herpes simplex virus, various cytomegalovirus. So if they get shingles, for example, it'll start off with a headache, and one way to avoid it being exacerbated is to just go into a fast or go into a ketogenic state right there. And if your gut is compromised and your blood-brain barrier is compromised and you're introducing food, there's a lot of toxins in the food that we're eating, whether
just
it be plant,
as a normal
no matter what
business.
Kind of diet you're eating, and even drinking water. So that becomes an additional challenge. And our immune system is kind of like an army, and there's only so much of a reserve that the army can have. But if you are under a chronically inflammatory state, then that army is occupied. And when you introduce things into the body, then there's very little reserve to deal with what's going on. If you're in a restricted diet, like an elimination diet, or if you're fasting, then you have all those reserves. Like your immune system is hyper vigilant against whatever's coming into your body because it's not dealing with it's not trying to detoxify, your liver's not working, everything is sort of hyper vigilant to be able to deal with the toxin. So and your blood-brain barrier is less compromised too in that context. So I think when we're in these vulnerable states, when we're dealing with an infection, when we're dealing with whether it be like herpes simplex virus or shingles or cytomegalovirus or a variety of different chronic sort of viral diseases, or bacterial like Lyme's disease too is a big one. And I think the etiology of many neurodegenerative diseases is actually a pathogen. And if you look at people with Alzheimer's disease or other neurodegenerative diseases, you find the Borrelia bacteria within the brain, and many of them test positive for Lyme disease. So it's a very controversial topic, and I think it needs to be studied more. The testing for Lyme disease needs to be studied more because it can go dormant, and then you're basically shows that you're not have an active, disease process. But in the context of many pathogens, whether it be viral, whether it be bacterial, or if you are dealing with an inflammatory issue, fasting and a ketogenic diet, which mimics many aspects of fasting, can be very beneficial.
Okay, so that part I don't understand. So I've got a chronic virus. Does it apply to COVID as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think,
so I've got a chronic virus, could be COVID, could be herpes, could be whatever. And now my immune system is going crazy. It's trying to deal with that. Then I eat and I introduce more bacteria, more viruses, more things that are problematic, whatever those might be. So that I fully understand. But why, if the real issue is the breakdown of the lining of my gut, which allows something into my bloodstream, which then triggers my immune, which then breaks down the barrier in my brain, which then allows toxins into my brain, why would a diet or taking exogenous ketones, something that mimics a fasted state, still be useful? Because my immune system's still occupied and I've still introduced something problematic. So what is it about the fasting mimicking protocol that allows my immune system to be useful?
Yeah. So there's multiple things going on. One is that you are clearing various things in the blood that could be perceived as a toxin, an antigen, that would otherwise occupy your immune system. So this idea of your immune system being like an army and there's limited reserves to that army. When you're in a fasted state, the gut is always regenerating with stem cells. So during a fasting period, it can actually increase the production of stem cells. So you're actually making the intestinal mucosa, and then by connection with the intestinal mucosa, the tight junctions, that becomes a more firm barrier function. Inside, we have an open tube from our mouth to our anus, and that's continuous exposure to the environment. And the more impermeable we make that barrier function, the better our immune system is going to be. We have 70 to 80% of our immune system is in our gut. So
I get it on the fasting. What I don't understand though is why I'm assuming taking exogenous ketones, something that gives me a sort of mimicked.
Yeah.
But why? Why does that work?
Well, if you're on a ketogenic diet or taking exogenous ketones, that can deal with a number of gut issues, gut dysbiosis, that could contribute to a breakdown of the intestinal mucosa and then the tight junctions. For example, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO, typically a consequence of a high-carb diet, processed food, going fasting, or there's research now looking at exogenous ketones and small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. We know that a carbohydrate-restricted diet, elimination diet, can help in that regard. And it goes back to this, the health of your gut will dictate, since your immune system is intimately linked to your gut, it will overall boost your immune system because there's less challenges for your immune system.
I realize that exogenous ketones help with the junctions.
Yeah, that research is ongoing, but there's so many other things. So just prior to coming on here, I looked, I went to clinicaltrials.gov and I put in exogenous ketones to see what new clinical trials, and 96 clinical trials came up. The last time I was here, it might have been a dozen, but there's 96 clinical trials looking at ketone supplementation. From most of it was like cardiovascular disease, there was cognitive, cancer, there was like probably a couple dozen with cancer looking into that. COVID-19, COPD, cystic fibrosis.
What are people
that's just a disease.
What are they hoping is the mechanism at play with ketones? Obviously it's a guess. This is early trials. I'm just curious if there's one sort of central thesis about what ketones are doing. So I had never heard the gut junction before. You were very clear, it's ongoing. Yeah. But is there something, is it stimulating stem cells? I'm making this shit up. I'm just curious though, what people are hoping or guessing at?
Well, we know that certain metabolic markers are improved with exogenous ketones. So they're being tested for type 2 diabetes right now, even type 1 diabetes. I was interested to see that. So if your metabolic markers are improving, if glycemia is going down and being more stable, if it's targeting various inflammatory pathways, we know that that's beneficial. So improving cardiometabolic health biomarkers, that's one way. But we also know that the ketone bodies, beta-hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate, they're signaling molecules. They are hormones in the body. And then
how do those get created on a ketogenic diet?
So on a ketogenic diet, we experience hyperketonemia directly proportional to fatty acid oxidation in the liver. So that triggers a process called ketogenesis. And fatty acid oxidation contributes to the production of acetyl-CoA, and then that can condense and form acetoacetate, and then beta-hydroxybutyrate, which then enters circulation. And beta-hydroxybutyrate is the main circulatory ketone or ketone in circulation, and it's usually in about a 4-to-1 or 3-to-1 ratio with acetoacetate.
So just to really simplify, are these all metabolites of fat metabolism?
They are. So I think of, when we start fasting or we go on a ketogenic diet, glucose goes down. If we're, say, fasting because it's easier, glucose goes down, glucose availability to the brain becomes limited. So we liberate fat from our adipose tissue, and that through beta oxidation of fatty acids in the liver, it takes long water insoluble fat molecules and chops them up like a wood chipper
In an
to
enzymatic
smaller
process?
It's an enzymatic process where you break down like beta oxidation of fatty acids is sort of a metabolic enzymatic process. And the breakdown products of fat are beta-hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate, and they're water-soluble fat molecules that then readily enter circulation. And they can cross, the benefit is that they can cross membranes through the monocarboxylic acid transporter and the blood-brain barrier. So they can freely get into cells and stimulate, energetic metabolism from the level of the mitochondria. And they do it better than glucose. And we can explain why if we can talk about, the glucose, the GLUT3 transporter, pyruvate dehydrogenase, complex.
I'm trying to keep this shit grounded here, Dom. This is getting very complicated.
There are many diseases where there's glucose impairment, and the ketones can bypass those enzymatic, rate-limiting enzymes like PDH complex or transporters, which would be the glucose 3 transporter in the brain, if we're just talking about the brain. So if we consume exogenous ketones, then we put that right into circulation. But going back to, you asked about ketone production in the body. So, ketone production directly correlates with suppression of insulin and insulin signaling, and that then contributes to a higher fatty acid oxidation, not only in the muscle, but also in the liver. And then accelerated fat oxidation, which never occurs with a standard American diet or a normal diet that people follow.
Because it has carbohydrates, sugar, tons of glucose.
A little bit of carbohydrates can really shut this process off. So that's why if your ketones are elevated even a little bit, that basically shows that you are oxidizing far more fat than 99% of the population. That's why ketones are an excellent biomarker or indicator of your fatty acid oxidation state. So breath ketones are probably more important because beta-hydroxybutyrate, when we're making it in the liver and it gets in circulation, it can give our brain energy and has anti-inflammatory effects and functions as a hormone, but it's being used for energy. So if we're sitting here in a fasted state and my ketones are 5 and I go for a quick walk around here, I could drop it down to 1 or 2 because the body's using that as a source of energy. Whereas your breath acetone is a really, really accurate indicator of your fatty acid oxidation state because we're blowing it off. It's not really being used as fuel. And it becomes a really important biomarker if you want to track your fat burning state.